don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Carole Geneix, the Director of Teaching and Learning at Washington International School, which is an International Baccalaureate school. Her work is heavily influenced by the inquiry-based structure of the IB and the thinking routines from Project Zero. And she first caught my attention last year when she published a Substack piece about the use of thinking routines and AI. Before I share some of the main points of our conversation, I'd like to invite you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to learn more about our professional development options. We specialize in personalizing professional learning from the starting points you'll find on our site, including workshops on project-based learning, knowledge-rich inquiry differentiation, AI in education, and enlightenment civics. In addition to our workshops, in person or virtually, we also offer several online courses, and we are in the early bird registration phase for PBL Grow 26, which is our summer conference held here on our home base of Louisville, Kentucky. You can find our many blogs and podcasts there as well. And as always, please feel free to email me directly at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any questions. The website again is wegrowteachers.com. The focus of my discussion with Carole is her approach in thinking about integrating artificial intelligence into existing pedagogy. She argues that AI does not bypass thinking, but instead changes it, and she introduces her perspective of viewing AI through three lenses: as an artifact, a process, and a material. She talked about how her school is adapting assessment practices, incorporating student voice, and promoting transparency in AI use, and emphasizes the need to avoid outright banning those tools. We also discussed the challenges and critiques of inquiry-based learning and her advocacy for teachers to be risk takers who use a thoughtful mix of instructional methods, including explicit instruction, to foster deep understanding in the age of AI. And now here's my conversation with Carole. I am with Carole Geneix, and we are going to talk about AI and thinking routines and teaching and learning. But before we do, Carole, I want to welcome you to the podcast and give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself. Give us a little background on who you are and what you do and all those important things.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. Good morning. And so my name is Carole Geneix. I am Director of Teaching and Learning at Washington International School in Washington, D.C. in the United States. I was born, raised, and educated in France, as you can maybe hear a little bit. I have a master's degree in literature as well as business administration. I've been a teacher and educator and administrator for more than 25 years. And so I started my career as a teacher in Seoul, South Korea, in a language institute. At the time, I really wanted to travel and see the world. I also lived in Russia for a little while, in Moscow, where I taught many adults. And then I went to the United States in 99. I was a teacher in the middle school, at the middle school level and high school level for many years. And we are an IB school, International Baccalaureate school. And so I was a diploma program teacher in the literature program and what is called language and literature program. IB is a very rigorous program, as you know. And so WIS is an IB school. A dual language program starts very early, and we have a French track and a Spanish track. And so the mission of the school is really, it was just our founder's day yesterday. Dorothy Goodman founded the school 60 years ago with 3 students, and her objective was to cure the world from monolingualism. And so this is something that is really at the core of what we do here at WIS. I am currently Director of Teaching and Learning, which means that I coordinate curriculum, all the professional development initiatives that we have internally and externally, I coach a lot of the teachers on campus, and I'm always interested in innovation and what innovation looks like, especially in the age of emerging technologies and AI in particular. We have a strong partnership with Project Zero, the research project center from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so my practice, both as a teacher and administrator, has been really informed by these ideas, as well as the inquiry-based structure of the International Baccalaureate. And so we are really lucky here in my school to be able to really explore a lot of different things based on inquiry.
Well, that's a heck of a background and much more than I anticipated. I guess several questions I would love to ask, and we won't get into all of them, but you say you grew up in France and were schooled in France. I'm curious how you would characterize the differences, one in between sort of the French model of schooling, if there is one, and maybe there's not. And then what was your experience like? Was it more, as a student, was it more constructivist? Was it more traditional, or a mix of both? What was that like?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I never really kind of reflected on my school experience in France, except for the fact that I just loved school from the beginning. I think from preschool, school was really my happy place. So we mainly have a public school system that is organized and decided by the Ministry of Education. And so unlike America, we have only one content, we have only one pedagogy, and then all the students, whether from a public school or a private school background, get the same education. And I was so surprised when I came to the United States to hear that the content of the curriculum was kind of decided more at the school district level, for example. And so that an education, for example, in my school could be really different from 3 miles away from us. And so that's a really big difference, I feel. France is obviously a smaller country than the United States, and I think this is much easier to implement. But this is really a major difference. The school system up to this day is rather traditional. And even though we have, I would say, pockets of innovation in France, the system kind of remains pretty top down, I would say, with the teacher really being more like a professor, like a college professor, lecturing and then delivering content to students. And so I think that would be what I see as the main difference between, generally speaking, public schools in France and also private schools, because they do have to follow the public school curriculum no matter what.
Gotcha.
And then here, where you have a multitude of opportunities, a multitude of different kinds of schools that deliver really different content and have really different ways of delivering this content.
So your schooling as a student was probably a bit more traditional then, if I'm understanding?
Yes, traditional. It was also some time ago. And I think things have changed a bit since. It was more traditional, but at the same time, I would say this was an excellent experience for me. Lots of choices and lots of ways for me to really learn. Back then we had books, encyclopedias. We would go to the library, and so there were still, even though I grew up in a very small town, still a lot of opportunities to really grow and become who you wanted to be. And I think that's one of the strengths of the public school system, or at least it was the strength back then. It was a place for equity. And a place where all children could thrive. It was not perfect, obviously.
And so the school where you're currently working is an IB school, and you mentioned inquiry-based learning. How do you characterize, I guess, when you think about, and how do you describe inquiry-based learning? This is something that if anybody listens to this podcast regularly, that I kind of travel in this sort of what I think is a false dichotomy or a spectrum of sorts between sort of more traditional instruction, direct instruction, and something that's much more progressive or constructive. constructivist, and inquiry-based learning, to me, can take and often takes a lot of different forms. It's largely a matter of how much guidance we're giving students, how much we're using questions to drive the learning. But there's lots of different ways in which inquiry, in my estimation, can show up. That's not always an opinion shared by everybody, but how do you describe the sort of IB approach and inquiry-based learning just in general?
This is a good question, and I think you answered some of it. I would say, generally speaking, we have to make sure that students are at the center of the learning. And then unlike, for example, my experience in France, where the teacher is at the center of the learning, the student has to be, whether it be because the student's, interest and curiosity will drive the content of the unit, or because like the classroom is going to be a space for questions and research. I think the element that is really central to it is this idea of students being the drive of the learning. I think it also has to come from different spaces, so it's not just the teachers implementing these ideas in the classroom, but it's also the administrators modeling these ideas. And so, for example, we as administrators often use the same techniques and the same routines at faculty meetings as the teachers would use in the classroom. And then also things like making sure the walls are telling the story of inquiry, making sure that we have documentation of student learning and thinking. And so we also believe in this value of making sure that this is a culture in the school, and it comes from all angles. Not the inquiry is not in the hands of teachers only.
Gotcha. Well, you mentioned Project Zero, and the thinking routines is something that we're going to talk about, and especially in conjunction with how we think about AI and use of AI in teaching and learning. Certainly a hot topic. We're big fans of the Project Zero and the thinking routines. We use them in our professional development. Ron Richard's been a guest on the podcast more than once. How do you describe and how do you characterize those thinking routines? I think that they're a form of inquiry-based learning, or a tool of inquiry-based learning. They're not exactly necessarily inquiry as many people might think about it, but can be, because there's a whole bunch of thinking routines. There's a whole set of them, and I think more perhaps being developed and adapted and that kind of thing. How do you characterize that work, and why do you think it's so valuable?
This is a big question, because Project Zero has so many different projects, and we were part of some of these projects in the past, and they have so many different facets. But I think at the center is this idea of elevating student voice, making sure the learning experience is equitable among all students, and then also decentering the teaching, and then making sure that students have multiple opportunities to learn by themselves, learn from each other, and then co-create the understanding in the classroom. And so, for example, thinking routines are often in triads, right? So, for example, you have the most famous one. I'm not sure why it became the most famous one. I think it's because it's related to works of art, but you have see, think, wonder, right? And so these are these three pieces. It's a very equitable experience in the sense that the first question is very simple. What do you see? And so, for example, you could be looking at a math formula, you could be looking at a famous work of art, but this is a very simple question that everybody can answer. And at the same time, if you do it, for example, as a whole group or even in small groups, the perspectives that will be expressed will be really interesting for everyone to hear. Think really goes a lot deeper into kind of the analysis of this work of art or formula or whatever it is, or text, and therefore is some sort of a scaffold for learning. And then wonder is really this space for inquiry and questioning and going really further into understanding. And so I feel like these structures always decenter the learning from the teacher to the student, and then make sure that everybody has a voice and everybody learn from their other colleagues or classmates and so forth. Routines are only one part. I like to also go beyond the routines, because behind the routines you have more general mindsets, you have more general projects. We were part of several. One was Agency by Design, and so it's a project that is based on maker-centered learning. And so besides the routines and besides the frameworks, you have sensitivity to design, you have participatory creativity, you have all these things that are more at the mindset level, I would say. And these are not easy, but I think these are really important for educators to know about, because these are the agents of change. If you do have the mindset for maker-centered learning or for inquiry, then these routines will be connecting with each other, and these routines will really change the culture of the school, for example.
How do you view the role of knowledge and content in the work of your teachers in your school? Is it something that's a high priority, a little bit less of a priority, and something more on skills and thinking skills or those kinds of things?
We do not sacrifice content, and so I think that's the beauty of an IB school. IB and Project Zero are very closely related, and then Project Zero is kind of the how of the IB, which provides a lot of the content, as you said. We have the diploma program in 11th and 12th grade for all our students, and so this is a very challenging situation because everybody takes the exams and everybody gets the diploma program. And so content is very high, but content is not just knowledge and skills. And so in a traditional education, you would have mainly content divided between knowledge, which is the more traditional approach, right? And then skills, the ability to write an essay, the ability to do sound and, academically rigorous research and so forth. And so we had this idea, we had this idea of understandings, so big concepts, big ideas, as well as dispositions. For the IB education, that means that students will develop attributes of the IB learner profile. And so you have different aspects to it. You have to be balanced and a good communicator, a risk taker, for example, which is a really interesting trait to have, right, in an academic context. It's really important for us to develop this kind of healthy risk-taking in terms of academics for our students. And then for an IB school, for us, this is part of the content. This is part of what we teach. And that's what makes it so valuable, because these attributes are transferable. These attributes create lifelong learners.
Okay. So I'm imagining, and I'll play devil's advocate here for a minute. We're going to get to the piece and talk about AI and these things that your blog from back in May of 25, seems like forever ago, touched on. I'm imagining folks who are more traditional science of learning kind of advocates are hearing you talking about decentering teaching and some of the things that you're saying, and their heads are exploding and becoming very angry. How do you think about and to the extent that you do think about the science of learning and cognitive science and research and evidence, which they would probably say those skills that you mentioned are not transferable, that critical thinking skills, for example, are domain specific. I think there's an argument to have a little bit more nuance and whether they're called critical thinking skills or something different. I've sort of unpacked that in some other podcasts and other places, but how do you think about the science of learning, the research, the evidence, and those kinds of things in how you work with your teachers and what you want from your school?
It's a very good question. I think we do delegate the research to these wonderful organizations who have full-time researchers. And so we take the outcome of the research from the IB, the outcome of the research from Project Zero, and then we do work with principal investigators and researchers from Project Zero. And so in the past, we've been kind of a field of research in the school, for example. We also have really people who are part of the IB and who create content for the IB, or principal examiners and so forth. And so we do also have this research component to our faculty. However, we really want to apply these ideas. And so I think there is less time for us to think about thinking, for example, and then more time for us to apply, to explore these ideas, to see what they can look like in practice. And I think this is really important in the age of AI, because research takes a long time. And so we rely on these researchers to provide data, to provide guidance, to provide frameworks. However, practitioners are first, because students are using AI, and the first round of research is just coming in after 3 years, but excuse me, nobody has waited for the research to start using AI. And I feel that we really need to make sure that we are risk takers and we have agency to try things out. And I think that's the innovative piece. Innovation and research work hand in hand, but in this case with AI in particular, and generally speaking, innovative technologies, we also have to jump in and use more of a design thinking process of iteration, prototyping, testing. We actually did this during the pandemic. In America, a lot of things closed down for a very long time, and so we were in distance learning, and then we were in hybrid, and there was no research behind it that we could. I mean, we did very basic, quick research. We had to close in a few days, right, and then pivot to distance learning. And so in some cases, we do have to be risk takers and do things before refining our practices.
So the piece that you and I first touched base about, and this was many months ago, and then we lost touch a little bit, and now we're obviously revisiting. This is from May of 25, and I think your thinking may have, and certainly AI and lots of things have changed since May of last year. It is titled "Teaching for Understanding with AI: A Roadmap." You talk about and share some thoughts using the Project Zero thinking routines and the way that AI you're seeing, or at least you were seeing it showing up in your school or with your students. Maybe unpack that, and are there any updates to how you're thinking about these things?
Right. Yes. So I think from the beginning, what I have done is making connections between who we are at the school, the pedagogies we use, and the rise of AI. So instead of trying to learn AI, I tried from the beginning to see what the connections were between what we do and then the potential of AI. And then one essential component that I already talked about is this idea of conceptual understandings and having an education based on big ideas and dispositions. And then one tool that is really interesting in this world of understanding is called the map of understanding. And so this is like a decade-long research around this idea of understanding and how understanding develops. And so trying to understand understanding. And so understanding is divided into different thinking moves, such as describing what's there, wondering, making connections, capturing the essence, and so forth. And so in this Substack that I wrote in May, I connected both. My idea is really that AI is not going to bypass thinking. There is no way that we're not going to think and we're going to let machines think for us. And I think that's a narrative that there is around AI, and that there was from day one. And from day one, I did have a different view. And so the idea was really to kind of see what we do with AI and then put it into this tool of the map of understanding and see where it goes. back then you said in May, which is a long time ago in AI time, right? What I did is that I was trying to figure out whether AI could mimic thinking, right? So I was trying to see what kind of thinking moves could be enacted by an AI, and they're basically large language models, right? We're talking more about text right now. And then certainly AI can do a lot of these things. It can describe what's there. I think this is kind of a tool that is good at explanations, right? It can build explanations, reason with evidence. Some AI tools are really good with this nowadays. You have, for example, Perplexity that kind of gives you a lot of resources, and that seems to be kind of now the first stop before more comprehensive research. And then it does things less well if you think about consider different perspectives, for example. So back then, my idea was, is the AI thinking or is the AI making thinking? And so that was the idea. But ever since, I think we have refined our thinking about it. And so we have a different framework where we consider AI as in three different ways. So there are three facets of AI that we think is interesting. One is the artifact of AI, so the product, and that's what I was talking about in my Substack. And so whatever AI produces, can it compete with thinking, right? Is it deep enough, et cetera, et cetera. But I think more importantly, AI is also a process. And what really matters is not the product. And I think that's why there's a shift. I think the more people use it, the more they engage in a conversation, the more they engage sometimes in a relationship or in something that goes way beyond the product. And then in that way, the process of engaging with AI becomes the center. Why? Because at the end of the day, we want to know not if the machine thinks. We know an AI does not think. We are being told it thinks. It doesn't. It predicts. It's a model based on predictions, right? It predicts the most probable answer to your request. And I think people are still not very clear on this. But what is more important is, what do we do when we use AI, when we interact with AI? What kind of thinking are we having? And I think this is crucial. And that's why the map of understanding is still very helpful. We have to be very reflective on things because it goes very fast. And so we need to slow down. We need to document what we do, and we need to be kind of using reflective skills in order to see what kind of thinking am I doing right now. We have at school some sort of what we call a learning group, and we have a cohort called AI Innovators. We have one cohort for our WIS teachers and then one cohort for the DC area. We happen to have the first session of this cohort for the DC area on Wednesday. And so one of the first things we did was really interesting. And so I asked the teachers to just describe what they had been doing with AI in the past week, for example. And then I asked them to put this post-it with their activity on the map of understanding. And it was a great tool. And so this time around, it was not about the AI producing something that mimics thinking. It was about them as a human being using the machine and see if some thinking had happened. And the interesting part was that all these cells had been documented. And so for some, considering different perspectives was at stake. For some, capturing the heart was at stake. For some, it was making connections. And so I think it's definitely a shift that is really mostly about the human thinking, and it's really important.
So do you have an example that you might be able to share of a teacher, how a teacher might use any of these thinking routines? You're talking about the map of understanding, but in your blog piece also talks about, I think, peeling the fruit. And, again, there's a ton of thinking routines. An example or way that you might suggest a teacher would engage, perhaps have their students engage with AI in a way that is not the cheating. Everybody seems, or not everybody, a lot of people seem to be very concerned about students cheating with AI. I think that's a reasonable concern. Certainly see that with some students. What would you suggest, like as an example of how a teacher might use AI and perhaps use thinking routines to do that in a way that isn't replacing the student's thinking, but is sort of maybe leveraging it?
That's a good question. I haven't thought of it in these terms. The thinking routines and the connections I make for teachers, because, for example, this Substack is mainly for teachers and educators, is here to model these connections, right? And so the teachers using AI in our setting do not necessarily associate the AI tool or practice with a specific thinking routines. I think it's more about the integration of AI into the unit and into the teaching. And so the idea is that they're going to teach about AI, and they're also going to use these AI tools as a way to teach the content. And so, for example, we have a middle school Spanish teacher who will use a unit on descriptive text in order to introduce image generators and how they work, and use this as a tool to provide some information about how image generators work, but also continue this skills about writing a description in Spanish and so forth. And so there is not necessarily a single thinking routine that you will use, but since it's an image, you will mostly have routines that come from this project called visible thinking. And so it could say think wonder, it could be other things. And so it really depends on what you do. The idea is really the content drives the process. We do not want to change our curriculum because AI is in the picture. And so the learning outcomes are still the same ones. And so the thinking routines might be the same ones or might belong to the same types of projects, if it makes sense.
Yeah. So are you, there's a big push now. I just had Jared Cooney Horvath on the podcast a few episodes ago, before the new year, and he's got a new book, Digital Delusion. Certainly lots of push for removing screens and technology from classrooms. I think that there's a colorable argument for that for sure. Is your school following that trend? Are you using?
We never went paperless, for example, and so we use technology, but again, so technology serves our mission, our core values about learning, our content, our curriculum, and not the other way. We're not a STEAM school, or we're not focusing, on technology in particular. And so we never had any mandate around using solely technology or not using technology at all. I think that would be a mistake, for example, to ban AI tools from schools. And so I know some school districts are still banning AI tools. I think it's good to find the right one. And so we never had a ban on AI tools, even before having a philosophy and a policy. And so I think in the new world, we need to be able to teach the skills to students, and they should be able to learn them. I think safety is very important. I think cybersecurity is very important. And so privacy is very important. And so there are a lot of parameters to choose a platform. We have Flint AI, which is a great tool. It's specifically for schools. It's specifically for students to be able to be on this platform. And it's really kind of, customizable. You can create activities. It's really a great tool. And so I think that's where we stand. A lot of science, a lot of history, a lot of math is still, written by hand, for example. So students they have notebooks, they have their laptop, they have their textbooks, but it's a balance. And I think it needs to be a balance.
Have your teachers had to sort of shift any of their practices, let's say around homework or assessment? Because again, that's one of the big concerns, right? That a student could go home, or if they have a laptop in classrooms, they could use AI to essentially say augment their thinking. That might be more charitable than necessary. Have AI write papers for them, have AI check answers for them, correct answers, so that when they do turn it in, they get the full credit and that kind of thing. Are your teachers having to sort of shift their practices on any of those things due to AI?
Yes, we do need to shift some things around assessment for sure. But I think the shift is not hopefully to limit academic honesty cases. It's more to kind of address this new reality of people being able to learn with it alongside AI, right? And so we ask all departments to create guidelines for assessment, for example. And so there are, I think, as long as everybody's aware of when they can use AI and when they cannot, I think we're in a good place. So assessments have not changed dramatically, but I think the guidelines need to be more specific. And so, for example, like in the languages, for example, is it okay to, ask AI to translate something? It's pretty good at languages right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it really depends on the assessment. IB is also great at giving guidelines, and so we also aligned with them. The organization right away issued statements that were AI positive. And so instead of saying the students were not able to use any type of AI and in any shape or form, they really provided case studies and guidelines for us to start the discussion around, is it okay to brainstorm with AI? Is it okay to start the research with AI and so forth? And so we are also informed by, the documents and the policies that IB provides. But yes, it's a definite shift. It's a shift as you go. So for higher ed, for example, it's a big issue. It's a big issue. And I see, I'm on various Facebook groups, and I see the difference. There are professors who are trying to ban AI and trying to not change their practices, and trying to find ways to limit the use of AI, and they are having a really bad time. And then there are these professors embracing AI and see where it belongs and where it doesn't, and also how they can change their practices. And so I think this is important. Transparency is key. And so all our departments have guidelines, because math, AI is notoriously bad at math. And so math teachers are not overly worried, but you have language teachers, for example, or history teachers. And so it looks different in different subjects. And I think that's important. The other piece that is really important is incorporating student voice in the discussion, because we never know what they do when they are not with us, right? We don't know for sure what they do for homework. And so in the upper school and our school, we have the student union, who has been in close touch with our subject coordinators in order to start a discussion around AI and academic honesty. So they have met all coordinators, they have met all departments, and they presented, to the administrators what they're worried about, what they're happy about, what they want to discuss with us, for more transparency, but also to incorporate AI and student voice into what we do. And so I think this is really important, because students are always one step ahead of us. And that's why I think we cannot continue working the same way. We will have to incorporate them in the process and in our decisions. That's the reason also why we love a new project from Project Zero called, it's also a website and an organization called the Center for Digital Thriving. This is a rather new center. The mission of the center is the idea of for young people to thrive in the digital age. It works closely with Common Sense Media and Common Sense Education, and provides routines, provide frameworks for teachers, for schools, for parents to use to guide the use of technology with students and children. And I think this is important, that the idea of incorporating student voice is at the core of what they do. They do their research around it, and they include student voice and surveys. A lot of students are against AI, for example. I think it's great to know. Right. And in the early days, we thought everybody was using AI, and their, early research showed that no, very few students were using AI. And then it changes, of course. And now we know, for example, they use AI a lot because it's not about companionship, but it's about, having something that listens to them, that is not judgmental. And so I remember this quote from a presentation by Carole Geneix, who is the co-director of Project Zero and also the co-director of the Center for Digital Thriving, saying, a young person was saying, I can ask AI anything. Parents or adults are so mean, and then it will judge me, and it's non-judgmental. We need to know that. We wouldn't think about this, right? Adults, we always think we're so helpful and we're so, kind, but they don't have the same view over parenting and then teachers and so forth. So I think this is really important.
So the Center for Digital Thriving, this is something I have not heard about. I'm curious. I'm wondering if either they and or you might have suggestions, sort of rule of thumb, right? So you mentioned professors and AI. I have a daughter who is in her first year of getting her education, elementary education certification, and has a history class, or just had a history class, and she was asked to write a paper, and on the directions it said absolutely no AI, which is an interesting. It's like you said, there are lots of professors that are we're banning it. We're not using it at all. You can't use it, and I understand the impulse. I understand why, but I wonder if there's a more nuanced rule of thumb we might use in terms of giving students guidance for what would be a good use of AI in something like writing a paper, and what is stepping over the bounds into something that might be something, I would assume, it's about academic dishonesty, right?
Right. You mean the Center for Digital Thriving? There is a piece about values. There is a piece that will help with academic honesty, but it's also about thriving. And so it goes way beyond that. But for the academic honesty piece, I think that's why transparency is so important. And that's why I think professors, teachers, educators should know how to use AI, should use AI as much as possible. For example, it doesn't make sense to me to say no AI. And why? Because Google has an AI overview. So does it fit this description of no AI at all?
Right.
It mean I cannot use Google?
Or Grammarly?
Pilot, right? Canva, like all the tools integrate AI. The new computers have AI, and therefore I think no AI is just expresses the fear of the teacher or the professor who doesn't want to engage in something they don't know. And I think being transparent, saying you can do brainstorming, you can, do pre-research and perplexity and that sort of things will really help. It's not going to help all the way, as I said, it's integrated. And so we often include a reflection. And so we want students to be metacognitive, and we want them to kind of reflect on what they did with AI or without, right? And so we have, for example, history essays or exercise where at the end you have a reflection box about what did you do with AI and how did it go? Because often the experience with AI is not necessarily a good one, right? It's not necessarily productive, or it's not necessarily going to give you what you need. And so the reflection about it is key. And in that case, if you assess that, this is really kind of the work of the student, obviously. And AI is not going to be able to talk much about another AI from a competing company, for example. And so it would be harder for a student to reflect a false reflection using AI than a genuine reflection. And so I think this is the way to go. If I was a teacher nowadays, I'm hoping I would be able to incorporate AI into the learning as much as possible.
Yes, I think the biggest fear, and I think it's a reasonable fear, is that AI is being used to sort of replace student thinking, right? That they're instead of the student doing the thinking, which then of course is going to lead to the learning, that the AI is that the students might be using the AI to do the thinking for them, and I think that's a reasonable fear. So it seems like if I'm thinking about a rule of thumb is uh, in what ways are you actually as the student, as the learner, doing the thinking, or at least doing some thinking with the thinking of another, right? And is it different if it's an AI tool providing you answers from, looking in an encyclopedia like we used to have to do, right? It's essentially when you read somebody and their work, is that's somebody else's thinking, and then how are you using that, and how are you reacting to that, how are you interpreting it, are you comprehending it correctly and using it in the way that it should be used? And I suppose the product that AI might, if it writes a paper for somebody and the student doesn't do much of the thinking or any of the thinking, then that's a real problem, right? But to your point, there's AI. Like, what do we mean by AI? Is Grammarly, which gives you anything from you should put a comma here to this is a better way to write this sentence. Is that is rewriting a sentence for you and you accepting that, and it's a better quote unquote better written sentence? Is that an unacceptable use of AI? I suppose the question might be, is it changing the student's thinking? And of course, the professor wouldn't know one way or the other. So it is tricky, right?
It is very tricky. However, I am really convinced that it doesn't bypass thinking. And I think this relates more to the fear that we have about AI. There's a lot of subjectivity in the way we think about it, whether we are really wowed by it or terrified. And I think a lot of people are terrified by AI and by the impact of AI onto learning, thinking, sustainability, you name it, right? I think in reality, it's much more complex than this. And I think, yes, it might change thinking. So eventually, I think 5 years or 10 years from now, thinking will probably look different. And this map of understanding, as I was saying, is more than, I think it's 20 years old. And I think there should be more research about thinking because it's going to be different, but I don't think it's going to be simpler. For example, has math changed since calculators? I don't think mathematical thinking has been kind of weakened by the rise of calculators, right? At first, people thought nobody's going to do math anymore because we have these machines. But in reality, these machines have become really complex, right? And so we need to decide when to use them, when not to use them. And also, these are mini computers. And so eventually, the students need also to be able to program them. And I think, to me, this is kind of the same kind of things. Superficially, yes, a calculator can calculate things for you, but is that all that math is about, numbers and operations? No, not at all. And so I think this simplifies greatly the narrative around AI, and I think it stems from fear and then from not understanding how it really works. But yes, it's a very common opinion. And also, if your assessment can be done by an AI, I think we need to change the assessment. But as I said, we are lucky we're an IB school. You won't be able to get rid of inquiry. And then, for example, analyzing understanding is much more complex for an AI than knowledge or skills. And so if you were to teach with AI, I think the thinking would still be there. Does it make sense? Like, sometimes cheating is harder and it requires, I mean, if it's, you can call it cheating, but you can also say, you can use AI if you want. But if using AI is more complex than actually doing the task for you, then that's fine. In my opinion, that's fine. Sometimes I don't use AI because I know it's going to be more difficult for me to actually produce what I want to produce than not using AI. And I think the choice also is important. And these choices are complex, are very complex. At this point, I have 5 AI tools, most pro versions, which is very, fine-tuned, right? It's very hard for me, even who is so interested in it, to keep track of all the changes and then the capabilities and so forth. And I think this choice itself is a complex task cognitively to accomplish.
I can imagine, again, a sort of critique of that in, I think the way that you're describing it, you're I guess the underlying assumption is that the work that you are trying to produce, you have high standards for. Your expectations are that it would be really high quality work, and therefore you're thinking what would be the best way to go about it, and maybe AI is going to be harder to get to that high quality work than not using it. But I can imagine, situations in some classrooms and some teachers where students are not necessarily particularly interested in high quality work. It's, how do I get the points and the grade and the scores? And so just having AI create something for you to sort of get those points and scores and just turn in something that ostensibly is passable would be where you might see a sort of unethical use of it, and one that would not show or necessitate much student thinking and learning. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think I come from a very privileged background in the sense that we are this independent school with the IB. And I would deem this very poor teaching. If a teacher assigns something and then there's no interaction between the teacher and the student until the student turns in something. And therefore, this would not happen with us because there would be checkpoints, because there would be drafting, because there would be some interaction between teacher and student until the final product is in the teacher's hands. And so this is not, to me, a fault of the AI tool. It's what is at fault is the teaching or the method of teaching and the assessing. And that's what needs to change if it happens. In our case, it doesn't, because for a big project or a big assessment, you have different steps before that. And then so the academic honesty piece is not really important. What is important for us is the learning of AI.
Yeah, so you're describing one of the values of Project Zero and the thinking routines is to make that thinking visible, right? And part of the reason you do that, not the only reason, but the part of the reason you do that is to check for understanding and be able to then be responsive as a teacher. And therein lies, I think, a really interesting question about the quality and the efficacy of teachers being able to do that, right? So this is a question and a concern and criticism that I hear about inquiry-based learning sometimes, is that it's really challenging to do well. And I don't think that that's necessarily a poor critique. I think to do really high level inquiry based learning, it does take some real skill, being really perceptive, having good questioning skills, knowing your content, understanding different types of questions and questioning techniques again. And so the folks who might be more sympathetic to something like direct or explicit instruction say it's easily quantifiable, and at the very least we're sort of delivering knowledge and ostensibly students getting some knowledge. And it's perhaps inequitable if you are not doing that, and there's a sort of I guess bias towards something that's more constructivist, something more inquiry, that isn't being done well enough to actually deliver some of those things that students will need as adults to sort of be prosperous as successful adults. So when you think about the sort of quality of teaching that you've mentioned, what are some of the things that you sort of value as sort of traits and characteristics of teachers to be able to do this, and how do you support them in developing those skills?
That's a good question. I don't think, in my opinion, inquiry is never, I've never really thought of inquiry as a model that is of less quality, or that is less equitable, or that is less rigorous than more traditional models. And so I'm going to think out loud.
So for example, I do think it's an unnecessary conflation that inquiry-based learning is essentially the same thing as discovery learning, that teachers aren't actually teaching, and that students are sort of left to sort of figure things out on their own. I say that's a poor. It's not accurate. It's not an accurate definition of inquiry-based learning, but I do think, and when I talked with Howard Gardner, for example, he mentioned, and I think he's right in that, insofar as progressive education sort of has been perhaps a bit too idealistic and romantic, insofar as that if you just sort of create the conditions for learning, students will learn, which I think can be true in some cases, but not necessarily true, and certainly not always true. And if that's not always true, and we have situations where teachers are engaging in, I'm going to do the making meaning routine because it's cool. It's I see my students interacting and they're doing some really interesting talking amongst each other. But at the end of the day, they're not really learning the things I wanted them to learn. They're not thinking in the ways I wanted them to think. And so those facilitating those things, I do think takes a real skill set. And for teachers to develop that, it takes time and some practice and some work. And so if we have teachers who don't have those skill sets, what do we do? And this is maybe not a fair question, because maybe all of your teachers or most of them have those skill sets. What do we do in the absence of those? Or how do we ensure, maybe a better way to ask this is, how do we ensure that teachers are not engaging in instructional approaches that I guess sort of outstrip their skill set, and then the outcomes that students have are less than optimal?
Yeah, it takes a big push. These ideas are still innovative, and it's still not across the board that we use, for example, inquiry in all IB schools around the world, I would say. And so for us, it has been a 20-year, process. And so it started with sending administrators to the Project Zero Classroom Institute in summer at Harvard, and then continued with a generous, professional development budget for teachers to go there too. And then we developed our own institute during the summer based on these Project Zero ideas, and so forth. And so this is a real commitment. And it's a commitment for schools and sometimes school districts. It takes a village, and this is not something you cannot put a thinking routine in the hands of a teacher and expect that this teacher is going to use these routines efficiently. Some will get it, and some will be really interested, but some need training and professional development, just like any other framework. And so, yes, it does take a lot of time. And I think at the core, there's a change in culture. And I think this is the same change with AI and with emerging technologies, because it really decenters us as the ones providing everything, providing the content, providing the structure and the rigor. And then we have to be all learners. We have to be, exploratory. We have to be curious, and we have to understand we don't have always the answers. And that's a mindset. It's a shift in mindset that takes a long time. But I would argue at the same time that even a 5-minute non-routine, something around dispositions or, understanding, or something like, for example, Project Zero has this famous question: what makes you say that? You can start with that. And even if it's just one question a period, that's okay, to me, baby steps are very valuable as well, because it signals to students that their voice matters, their curiosity is important for the teachers, even if you have standardized testing at the end of the year. And so I think this is really important. And it doesn't take much to provide the structure for 5 minutes, or have something on the wall that represent process versus product, for example. So I believe in baby steps as well.
Yeah, the what makes you say that is, and I've written about it, and we talk about that in our workshops as well. Sort of the idea of facilitative questioning, right? So what are the different ways you can say that question that will sort of surface the student thinking, so that you can then be responsive, build on it, correct it, all of those kinds of things. And so, in the sort of spirit of that, when you ask a student, what makes you say that, or a version of that, and they come back with something that is incorrect information, right? They totally misunderstand something. They don't understand this concept. They've misread something, whatever it might be. I would say that that's a time where you step in and perhaps use some explicit teaching and instruction. And so I'm curious how you think about and talk about explicit or direct instruction in the classrooms and in the schools and the school in which you're working.
Right. Yes, I think I agree with you. And I think inquiry teaching is situational. It doesn't happen all the time, and it's absolutely okay. For example, at the diploma level, the science subjects, there are multiple choice exercises on the exam. And then there is what is called the internal assessment, and that's completely inquiry based and student driven. And you have both. And so the teaching is different for the internal assessment and then multiple choice. And I think that's okay to have, various skills, but you do have to have the skills, but also the tools and the mindset. And I think being a really good teacher is being able to redirect the conversation, is being able to correct the student without humiliating the student in front of everyone, right? It's be able to really make sure that it's not just about the questions, but it's also about everything else, and then choosing the right approach. And so I think people think of inquiry as, kind of just the ocean, right? Trevor McKenzie, who's kind of the inquiry guru, has this really great visual where you have the ocean, and then you have a pool, and then you have different parts of the pool, from the shallow end to the deep end, and then from a place where it's very structured and very safe to a place where maybe there is a lifeguard, but that's it. And I think there are different steps and different ways of looking at it, but it's not the ocean, and then it is definitely just the pool. And so a really great teacher will be able to make this mistake that a student makes a teachable moment for the student. And it, as I said, it's different. It's different according to the setting and the context.
Yeah, we sort of lean into Hattie's teach with intent, or intent to teach framework, and the idea of surface, deepen, transfer, and then thinking about explicit instruction and inquiry activities and exercises and collaboration, and a mix of those things, right? So there's nothing wrong with students memorizing things. There's nothing wrong with, and certainly lots of value to explicit instruction and explaining things with real clarity, and doing some of those moves, I do, you do, we do, those kinds of things. But then pairing them with inquiry and collaboration. Sometimes inquiry can work before explicit instruction. I know a lot of traditional folks will balk at that. There's certainly some evidence, and I can give some examples of that. But then also, can follow explicit instruction, and it can be all of those things. But the different ways in which you sort of mix those approaches, I think, is essentially determined by the academic outcomes and whether they're surface knowledge or connected and deep and transfer knowledge and the complexities, the ways in which you want students to think. All of those tools should be in a really effective teacher's toolbox, and not be afraid to use any or all of them, and sort of get away from this sort of either or approach, is sort of dichotomous thinking kind of thing. So
Exactly.
I don't know if
Yes.
Well, in my full time, I don't know if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about. And if so, now would be the time to mention those things.
Yeah, there's a third facet of AI that I haven't even been able to, to touch, because it's such a big deal, and it will become a bigger deal in the future. Is not only AI as a product or a process, but AI as material. And so eventually, I think there will be a time when students can really customize their own chatbots, make their own chatbots, and being very savvy at understanding that AI is not just product and process, but also something that is in the realm of making, of agency, and of exactly using AI to address our needs. And I think it's in the future. This is what we do in our workshops. We have people create their own chatbots, and it's very interesting because you have to really understand how it works in order to kind of have something that is comprehensive, and it gives a lot of agency. I think we have to really kind of take back this idea of we are the ones choosing everything regarding teaching and learning, and so that's a very empowering piece, but it's in the making, and it's still at a very early stage, I would say.
Gotcha. Well, I know the Substack is called Learning, and I'm not sure. I guess you have it in brackets for a reason, with AI.
Yeah, the idea is to learn about AI and learning with AI at the same time, and that's why there's the bracket.
Right. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. It's learningwithai.substack.com. Any other places or things you'd like to share before we jump off?
No, this was really great, Drew. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss these important topics.
Yeah, well, thank you for the conversation. And as I often say, I hope folks find it helpful.
Great. Thank you so much.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.